Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation Podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Kaylee McNamara. Well, I am honored today to have Ambassador Swanee Hunt on the podcast. She is chair and founder of Hunt Alternatives and the Eleanor Roosevelt Lecturer of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Thank you so much for joining us.
Haley, I've read about you, and you, I'm sure, are going to live up to fabulous things. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, you're too kind. I'm so excited for today's conversation. And while we'll be talking today about sexual exploitation issues, maybe to start off, could you just describe a bit of your background and your journey to being a leader on women's issues?
Oh, well, thank you, first of all, for saying that. I came from a very, very conservative family in Dallas, Texas. I was born in 1950, which makes me old. And I was so shaped by that sense of not being able to make my own decisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that I was pushing up against a lot. But and then the women's movement came along, and Hillary Clinton and Gloria Steinem and I were all out in the streets, and it was fabulous. Then I started the foundation, my sister and I, and we were looking at what was happening to people on the street, and particularly young people, and particularly girls. And I that was the first time I started realizing there is this whole population out there that I know nothing about. And then I was part of a women's foundation and sort of got more and more into learning about this, and then became ambassador to Austria. And it was 4 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And if you think about that, that's when all the economies imploded. Yeah. And there were 6,000 women and girls from just Poland on the streets of just Frankfurt.
Wow.
And they were told they didn't have a job anymore, and they had families and all. They said, well, we have a job. A guy would say, I have a job for you, as a waitress or as a model in Frankfurt. And she'd get on the train. They'd say, I have to have your passport. And she would give it to him. And then his friend would take a picture of her being raped by him and say, we're going to send this to your mother back in Poland. I mean, that was the story. And so I wrote about this in Foreign Affairs, which is a famous journal. And that started the ball rolling in terms of the US government. And out of that came the Office for Trafficking, to stop global trafficking, at the State Department. Then I went to, after that, I went to Harvard. It was a very soft landing from being ambassador. And I went there because they wanted to create something for women. And I'm a pretty good organizer. So we created the Women in Public Policy program, which is the largest of any kind of organization at Harvard for women. And so I just became steeped more and more. So that combination of my personal and then the historical, seeing it happening right in front of me, and from where I was in Vienna, and just the tragedy. Haley, I would talk with some women. I did this all over the place, 22 trips, and I would say, tell me what's on your mind, what's happening. And one of them said to me, I'm going to try to say this without crying because I'm a mother. She said, our girls are disappearing from our villages. Oh. And I thought, what is that like? It's one thing to have your daughter die. It's one thing to have whatever, but our girls are disappearing. And that really brought it home for me. And go ahead.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. And it's incredible how true those same themes of what you shared are continuing to this day, of the images being used to blackmail, and especially times of economic crisis or conflict.
Yes, it's exactly right.
Right now.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Violent conflict is a breeding ground And by the way, in that story I just told you, I said story but it's not made up. Right? In that story, you have two characters, right? You have her in desperate need, and really desperate. Her brother needs, a surgery or whatever. And then you have the pimp, right, who has picked her up, etc. And what the story leaves out is, why does it work for her to be on the streets of Frankfurt along with another 6,000 or so women and girls? And the reason it works is because it's about supply and demand.
Mm.
All the pimps are is distribution. These are business people, mostly guys. And that's the part that we just keep missing. That when you and I talk about the buyers, people think it's the pimps, but it's not the pimps. The buyers are at the retail level.
Mm.
The pimps are at the wholesale level. And I didn't think about that analogy till just now. So I tell you, Haley, we're going to talk again sometime, because that is good. It really says it. I've been trying to think, how do I explain this?
Yeah.
It's hard because I go and talk to a congressperson, and they say, "Oh yeah, you're right. Oh, the buyers are terrible. We're going to get those pimps." And I said, "No, actually, it's not the pimps. It's the Johns." And, "Yeah, I agree. They're really terrible. We're going to get those pimps." I said, "No, that's not because then I think, well, why don't we want to understand that?" And that's because it's our brothers, people I was sitting next to at Thanksgiving. It's someone at church, in the church pew. It's people in my class, and just statistically. And that's really hard to get your mind around.
That really is. And I think, so you were seeing this dynamic playing out while abroad, and then you really internalized it and brought it to the United States.
Yeah.
And you founded the organization Demand Abolition. Can you tell us a bit about the vision and goal of that organization?
Yeah. And I've had a private family foundation. As you can tell, I'm wealthy, right? Look at the trappings from this Dallas oil and gas family. And so I had a foundation that I started in 1930. I was 30, so 1980.
I was going to say.
I'm not that old. I didn't start
No
my
way.
foundation in 1930. Anyway, and I wanted to do something when I got back from Vienna. I wanted to do something on women and human rights, having seen this. And so I thought, well, I'm going to do something about the trafficking. It was so egregious. And I'd headed up a delegation for the United States to the European Union, blah, 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 blah. And then I remembered at that meeting, on the last day, it was a 3-day meeting. On the last day, a tall blonde man stood up in the back, and I say the tall blonde for a reason. And he said, when are we going to say the words that this wouldn't be happening if there weren't men buying these women and girls? And I thought, oh, bingo.
Yeah.
I mean, it just, isn't it interesting that we can think about that? But there is a commodification, right? And this whole business about, consensual, and, oh, well, she didn't, she wasn't chained, and, it's called coercion, right? There are a lot of ways. If a pimp says to you, if you say anything, or if you squeal, I know where your sister lives, you tell me how that's consensual.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, so that's when we started. I have a cousin who's a Republican congressman, and he was on the board of the foundation, and he had been this head of this part of the State Department. He was the ambassador at large dealing with trafficking. And he said, look, there is only one way to get to this. You have to stop the buyers. And I said, well, but that's just really hard. Boys will be boys. And he said, well, that's pretty insulting. You think, really, we can't control our emotions? Really? Is that what you're saying? And then I realized, yeah, that is insulting. I mean, I wouldn't want to have someone say that about me, that I can't I can't think, I can't control my thoughts because I'm a woman. I mean, we did, do you remember? You don't, because you're too young, but in the 70s, it was like a woman couldn't be a prime minister because when she had her period, she would be too, too crazy, right? Well, it's kind of like saying the same thing, this boys will be boys thing. But it is true. And like so then we start doing all kinds of research, and they're all different studies. The first one we did, it was 86% of the men that we interviewed said that they would stop. They would actually just stop doing any buying if a member of their family was going to find out.
Wow.
And you think, wow, that is right. So there's a whole lot about shame. And so then you think, well, should we arrest them and put their pictures up on a billboard? And my daughter said, I will not be part of this foundation if we're doing that, because you're sort of exchanging evil for evil, blah, 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 and think about the families. And then there was, when she said that, there was a survivor, one of the women who'd been trafficked, in the room. And now this is about nuance, but I think it takes you there. And she said, so who do you think has been so concerned about my daughter and what she thinks about me? And wow, I mean, it's like this is not for the faint of heart. I guess that's what I'm saying. And Haley, I'm part of Nicosi, right? And I'm on the board now. And Nicosi has taken up this issue of stopping the demand as part of a look at this whole big set of sexual exploitation, because this is really gender-based violence. You could say, you can't beat up a woman that, that's at home. Well, you can't buy and do whatever you want to a woman or a girl that's, being advertised. So.
And in your research, you all also set up what I thought was a really brilliant idea. And I remember reading about it, that your CEASE networks, the Cities Empowered Against Sexual Exploitation, even before I came to Nicosi, I remember reading about this approach where you were looking at different cities and trying to figure out the best ways to stop commercial sexual exploitation, to reduce sex buying. And I just thought it was such a brilliant idea to just take these ideas out of the philosophical debate and see what actually works in practice. Can you maybe share a bit about what you learned from those cities?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, thank you for reminding me what CEASE stands for. I actually came up with the acronym, and I keep forgetting. Cities Empowered Against Sexual Exploitation. Okay, it's a great name. All right, so we found, and we went through a whole process of, different cities wanted to be one of them, and then we said, okay, everyone has to put together a group, and the group has about 8 people. And what we went really light on was NGOs. That wasn't the conversation. It wasn't about mine and yours and donors and all of that and different approaches. This really was about going to assume a couple of things. And one is that this is very much a law enforcement issue. I don't want to put these guys in jail. I mean, unless it's a girl under 18, and then you've got a whole thing of statutory rape and felony, et cetera. But generally speaking, this for me isn't about that kind of punishment. It's really about, let's just get him to stop, right? And there are all kinds of ways. And so we use these 12 cities as petri dishes. We weren't trying to flip the country and let's start with these 12 cities and get them to reduce the demand for the sex trafficking. We just said, how do you do it? And how you do it in Dallas, Texas is real different from what you do in Boston, Massachusetts, just culturally.
Yeah.
So for about 6 years, we had this team in each one. And of course, it had a survivor who was on the team. And And there had to be a political person, like really high up, someone, either the mayor, the governor, or representing him or her. Because again, it goes to political will and it goes to training of law enforcement. This does. It's not about, it's not about, gee, is this awful? And let's convince people that this is awful. It's pretty evident to people that the damage you do to these women and girls is irreparable, whether it's one time or, or 10 years. But what we wanted to see is, what are these tactics? And so we isolated 21 of them. Then we could evaluate them. And we could say, well, how expensive is this one to do? And how much effort, and how likely is it to succeed, et cetera. The reason we wanted to have those tactics is so that we could go to the Hill, Capitol Hill, and we'd be talking to someone who would say, oh, well, boys will be boys. And then we could say, well, actually, no, they don't. Well, they could be boys, but they need to grow up and understand that they need to stop. And you know what? The majority actually, or a large, I can't remember the stat, but a large number of the men actually want to stop. So, and so we say to Congresswoman from wherever, it is doable. It's actually doable back in your state. And let me tell you what the capital of your state has been doing. So let's make it Denver, Colorado. And we will say, it used to be, and this is true, it used to be that you would, if you saw a couple, right, and they were having illegal sex. Oh, by the way, did you know that this is illegal almost everywhere in the country except outside of Las Vegas? Oh, and the other thing you have to know is that, unfortunately, you can't separate sex trafficking from prostitution. The reason is it's embedded. It's embedded, and a buyer doesn't go up to someone and say, have you been trafficked?
Right.
It's not the conversation. The conversation is how much for what, right? And so people really don't want to talk about prostitution, but it's just unfortunate. That's how you have to get to it. So, so Denver, the cops would come in, and 75% of the time they would pick up the woman.
They would arrest the woman.
Right. And they would arrest her. And the man would be told, go home to your wife. Right. And now it's flipped. And 75% of the time it's the buyer they're picking up. And that took, how does that, you didn't have to have a change in the law. I mean, that is all about political will and what the police chief says. Here's the policy. It's been so hard to get the law enforcement to do it, and just, take a step back. And, I love cops, but, there certain number of them are buyers, or their brother is, or the man who's sitting next to them at the station, or the man who's in the car, as his, as his, whatever you call it, his buddy going on, doing the patrol with him. It's very, very, very hard to get police to
build that will. Did you find that trainings or maybe survivors speaking with law enforcement seems to be one effective way of the will to address demand?
I don't know, but I'm going to write that down, and we're going to test that about the survivors speaking to law enforcement. But I do know. No, actually, I do know. We put together a conference where we had, actually, you know what we did? We had survivors up on a stage with the law enforcement.
Oh,
and there were like 3 of each, and not sitting in a row, just kind of staged, like this one's standing, this one's sitting. It was really alive, and it was this free conversation among them. And boy, these guys got it. They really got it when they were face to face. But where I started to go with your question, there was a woman, and the reason they don't want to say a prostitute is because it's like they're making this big choice, right? And instead of having been prostituted, so they call themselves survivors. So Norma Hotelling was her name in San Francisco, and she and somebody else started a what she called a John's School. Now, that's cute, but John's School, you get sent to it when you're arrested.
Mhm.
And it's only 1 day or 2 days. And you're sitting in this room with these 60 other guys. And there's a whole, public health comes in, says you're going to get horrible, STDs, and so comes in saying, your mother's going to find whatever. And they tell you all the reasons not to do that. And then Michael Shively, a researcher, did this Department of Justice funded grant. I mention that because this was very serious, this grant. It was like $500,000 to go and study this. And he found that the recidivism of the guys who went to this very simple school compared to other guys who didn't, it was 40% lower. Now, the reason I'm so taken with that is when we asked the guys what would stop you, they said, if my family member was going to find out, if I was going to be put on the sex offenders registry, and you just go down the list, if I'm going to be arrested, all the way down, huge fine, whatever. And one of the lowest ones is a community education kind of program I have to go to. And that was 40%.
Oh, wow.
And I thought that is really, really interesting because it looks so low when it's on that list. I say all that, Haley, to say there are 21 different ways you can impound their car. There's one place, I think it's in Chicago, they impound the car and they say you can get it back if your wife comes to get it.
Mm.
In Norway, they send the court date not in an envelope. They send it on a postcard to your house.
Oh, interesting.
So these guys are racing to the post box, to try to get there, in the mailbox, to try to get there before their partner does.
Mm.
Some of these scenes, we can smile about because we, just how clever. Boy, getting someone to stop. That there's a lot of tragedy in that. You think about what that's doing to the family. Oh my God. Oh my God. The marriages that stay together, you never rebuild that trust fully.
Yeah.
And the ones that split up, those kids, they know or they don't know why, but they're going back and forth between their parents and they find out why. Yeah. Sometimes the kids have found out before the parents, before the wife does. Yeah. It's pretty hard. It's really horrible.
I think it's incredible knowing that there are these 21 tactics, like you said, everything from impounding a car to switching the law enforcement resources to focusing on the buyers instead
That's
of
right.
women. Seems so many different options. And I suppose it gives me a lot of hope because a lot of people, like we sort of were talking about at the beginning, say, oh, well, buying sex is inevitable. This is just always going to happen. It's always happened in our history. But it seems like there really are solutions that could reduce that.
And there's some good news on one is about our research and one is applied. So our research, when we asked 8,000 men, and this was online and it was self-reported. Okay, but 8,000 is a big number. So we asked, that's huge in this kind of research. And we asked them if they would stop. And a huge number of them said yes, and here's what would stop me. And so you get all of this data, but on the the biggest part of the finding is of those 8,000, only 20% said that they had ever bought at any point. 20%, because we have so normalized it to think, well, this is what men do. Actually, no, 80% of men don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a shocker. And so then you go to Sweden, and when the Queen and the some very strong NGOs working on women's issues, and the parliament got to the point of being about 45% women. That's important. They passed a law, and they said, we're going to focus on the guys, the buyers, which doesn't sound so iconoclastic right now because we've been talking about this, for however long. But at that point, I mean, you wouldn't believe how the Norwegians laughed at the Swedes, at the Swedes. I mean, it's like, you're idiots. And 10 years later, Norway passed a stricter law. And it was basically, you just can't do this. You can't buy. And so the trafficking, there's this huge issue of sex trafficking going through countries. And basically the traffickers started going around Sweden because it was going to be too dangerous to deal with that law. The Norwegians, when they passed their law, I've gone to these places and spent a lot of time talking to people. The head of the NGO told me that the first man who was arrested was a member of the parliament.
Oh, wow.
And he had gone to a conference in Paris. And that's how far they have gone, that they will arrest a man outside of the country who is, a citizen. And I mean, so different countries are doing it different ways. And I'm not saying which way the US should do it. What I do know is that in Sweden, the number of and percentage of women being prostituted and trafficked, it just plummeted. And the same then was true in Norway, and Canada's picked it up now, and France and Israel. I mean, the good news is the good news, bad news is that we're not breaking new ground here for our country.
Well, and anytime that traffickers and pimps are saying, well, skip that country because it's too complicated and tough to sell victims, I'm interested in what that country is doing.
Right. That's right.
And I think that's a good place to look. And it looks like really focusing on the demand reduction is such a key linchpin in all of those examples.
Haley, I don't know how else you do it. I teach this at Harvard, and it seems to me you've got a triangle, and you've got supply and demand and distribution. Okay. And the supply is impoverished women and girls. And by the way, about 60% of the girls are coming out of foster care, and they're Black and brown. That's the profile. I mean, let's be really straight about this. Okay. So you've got the supply. So let's deal with poverty and women. Well, okay. So then let's deal with the pimp, because the poverty in women, we're not going to make enough headway fast enough. And so instead, we can't do the men, the buyers, because that's just too difficult, because boys will be boys. So we're going to have to go to the pimps. Well, do you know, pimps make like $250,000 a year. I mean, they can hire Rudy Giuliani as their attorney. And it's very, very, very hard to win a case. FBI gets all excited, if they win one, but it's very, very few. It's nothing really. Yeah. And partly because the women make such bad witnesses, because they're on drugs. They're looking, at the guy in the courtroom who's the first man they ever called daddy, ever. Right. Anyway, so that leaves you with only one group, and that's the buyers in terms of the supply and demand. And so the bad news is that's where you have to focus, but the good news is we know how.
Yeah, and then it seems effective. It seems like there are these tactics that are actually making headway.
Right.
My last real question for you is, so I think it's so important to be focusing on the demand reduction. Like you said, they're feeding really this entire marketplace, and they're actually the sole revenue source for the pimps and traffickers.
Yeah, exactly.
Money's coming from.
Oh yeah, because the women and girls aren't getting the money, right? And in fact, it's the second largest source of money for organized crime. And the first one is drugs, and then the women, the sex trafficking and guns are tied for number two. So I mean, that's where the big dollars are going, like tens of billions every year.
And with all of the time that you've spent focusing on demand reduction, I mean, I'm sure that you believe, or I'd be curious your thoughts on, is this, have you come to feel like this is a gender equality issue as well? Because it is so often men who are buying access to women's bodies. Is that an important lens for looking at sex buying?
I don't know how you can not think that. I know some really wonderful men who are Johns, and if you were to ask me, does this guy think that women are commodities? I would say no. I mean, because I know how he acts with his wife and at work, etc. So sometimes it's like there's this compartment in their brain. I wouldn't be a guy for anything in the world. Oh my gosh, because they can compartmentalize like this, and it's like, this is my private life, and all the rest of me looks like I am. I'm white. I have an income of well over $100,000. I'm married with kids, and this is the profile. There's this little bitty group, less than 1% of the men in the country who are responsible for 75% of the transactions. But to your point about, is it gender? It's also racial. And in fact, how much I care about women's. For me, the whole business about white entitlement, that does it for me. That it's guys with white entitlement who are buying black and brown girls. There's an age issue. There's a gender issue. There's also that it's a race issue also. So everything about it's wrong. And and when you ask the guys about the experience right after they've been with a woman, when they describe it, they use a lot of negative language compared to when they talk about something else. In other words, for them, it's not a wonderful experience. They are caught up in this. Some of them are addicts and are buying like 2 or 3 times a week. And that's how it turns out that they are responsible for 75% of the transactions. But they, guys who are doing this, that fits in at the beginning where I said like 86% said that if someone in their family was going to find out, because they're ashamed of it. And they should be, and they need to stop. So, and good news is we can do this.
We can do it. Well, thank you so much for your time and talking about these issues with us. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. Do you have any final parting thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I will. And that is that as this movement has been spreading, it's really interesting how difficult it has been for the United States. Because we have these 50 states, and each one of them has their laws, and the state laws don't even mesh with their municipal laws and all of that. And so it's not for the faint of heart. And we shouldn't think that when we hear this issue over and over, that it's because the issue is the wrong issue. There's just a lot of barriers, and we could go into that culturally. There's this whole idea of, well, it's my choice, it's my body, etc. And actually, no, you can't do something that is going to fuel a market that is destroying the lives of others. You just no. And so, these complications, but Haley, you're on the side of the angels. And I really, this was a good way to start my day.
Oh, well, thank you so much. You're also on the side of the angels. I'm happy to be on your side of these issues. And I'm just so thankful for, really, this is a message of hope. While these are really dark issues, what we talked about today is that there are answers, and the answers are working where they're being implemented.
Yes.
So, thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Bye.
Bye.